He was removed quietly, without accusation, without farewell, just a badge returned and a door closing. What remained was a child watching from a distance, and a woman who would later realize that safety is sometimes mistaken for obedience, and truth rarely announces itself. Stay with this moment. Let it unfold at its own pace. The building did not look different that morning. The floors were still polished, the lights steady, the air faintly scented with citrus and metal. He arrived early, as he always did, passing through the service entrance with the same measured steps, nodding once to the guard at the desk. Routine had long ago replaced pride. It was easier that way. He signed in, clipped the badge to his jacket, and reviewed the schedule without surprise. Nothing on it belonged to him personally. It never did. His work existed in margins between doors opening and closing, between elevators rising and stopping, between moments that were meant to pass without notice. He was good at that kind of presence. When the request came, it did not arrive as an order. It was phrased as a formality. The supervisor asked him to follow, voice neutral, eyes avoiding his. They walked together down a corridor that overlooked a city, glass stretching wide enough to make the height feel unreal. He had walked this path many times before. This time, it was quiet in a different way. Inside the office, there was a folder already on the table. No one raised their voice. No one accused him of anything. The words were careful, practiced, a restructuring, a reassessment, a decision made in the interest of alignment. He listened without interruption, hands resting on his knees, posture straight. Years of service had taught him how to receive difficult information without visible reaction. When they asked for his badge, he unclipped it slowly, placing it on the table as though it might bruise if dropped. The weight of it surprised him. It always did at the end. He signed where they indicated. He thanked them. It was automatic, the way breathing is automatic. Gratitude had become a reflex, even when it no longer belonged. No one offered an explanation. None was demanded. As he was escorted back through the corridor, the city below looked unchanged. Traffic moved. Light shifted. Somewhere, people were starting their days. He wondered briefly how many quiet endings were happening at the same time, unnoticed. The last door closed with a soft sound. Not a slam, just a click. Final and polite. He stepped outside, the winter air sharper than expected. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, feeling the absence where the badge had been. It was strange how quickly a role could vanish, leaving no mark on the body, only on the shape of the day ahead. Across town, in a building smaller and older, his child sat at a classroom table, feet not quite touching the floor. A worksheet lay unfinished. Pencil paused. The child did not know what had changed, only that something felt unsettled, like a sound just beyond hearing. When school ended, he was waiting as usual. He always was, coat buttoned, expression calm. The child ran the last few steps, backpack thudding lightly against their side. "You're early," the child said. He nodded. "My day ended sooner." They walked home together, the route familiar. The child talked about small things a classmate's joke. A story, read aloud, the promise of soup for dinner. He listened, answering when needed, adjusting his pace to match shorter steps. At the crosswalk, he placed a hand on the child's shoulder, guiding gently. Protection did not require explanation. It lived in habits. At home, he hung his coat in the same place. The apartment was warm, tidy. He washed his hands, set water to boil, moved to the kitchen with practiced ease. The child sat at the table, swinging their legs, watching him with quiet attention. Nothing in the room announced loss. There were no raised voices, no broken objects, no visible signs of rupture. Only a man stirring soup a little longer than necessary, and a child who sensed the care beneath the silence. Later, after homework and dishes, after the child had been tucked into bed with a book resting open on their chest, he sat alone at the small table. The evening pressed softly against the windows. He did not replay the conversation in his mind. He did not imagine arguments he could have made. He had learned long ago that some truths surfaced only when they were ready, not when they were demanded. For now, there was tomorrow to prepare for. A child to wake, a breakfast to make, a life to keep steady. He turned off the light and stood in the quiet, holding on to what remained. Morning came without ceremony. The alarm sounded once, soft and familiar, and he reached out to silence it before it could wake the child in the next room. Light pressed gently through the thin curtains, revealing dust on the windowsill and the faint outline of buildings across the street. Nothing here pretended to be more than it was. He moved quietly through the apartment, careful with each step. The floor creaked in one place near the kitchen doorway, and he avoided it out of habit. Water went on to boil. Bread warmed in the pan. The smell of toast and coffee settled into the air, steadying in its predictability. The child appeared a few minutes later, hair rumpled, eyes still half held by sleep. They sat at the table without being told, pulling the chair closed with a soft scrape. He set a plate in front of them, poured juice, and waited until they had taken the first bite before sitting himself. "You don't have work today?" the child asked, not looking up. "Not today," he said. "Tomorrow?" He paused just long enough to be honest without burden. "I'll be home more for a while." The child nodded, accepting this as information rather than problem. They ate quietly after that, legs swinging, crumbs collecting on the table. Children understood change differently. They noticed tone, absence, presence. They did not require full explanations to feel safe. After breakfast, backpacks were checked, lunches packed. He zipped the child's coat, adjusting the scarf with careful fingers. Outside, the air was cold but bright, the kind that made breath visible for a second before it disappeared. The walk to school took 12 minutes if they went at the child's pace. He did not rush it. They stopped to watch a delivery truck struggle into a narrow space, laughed briefly when a pigeon scattered at their feet. At the school gate, the child hugged him once, quick and firm. "You'll be here?" the child asked. "Yes," he said, "like always." He watched until they disappeared inside, then turned back the way he had come. The day stretched differently now. There were hours that did not belong to anyone else's schedule. He cleaned the apartment more thoroughly than necessary, folded laundry already folded, checked the budget written neatly in a small notebook. Numbers were adjusted with care, not panic. He had learned to live within edges. In the afternoon, he stopped by the local market. He chose vegetables slowly, comparing prices, weighing each decision without resentment. The cashier greeted him by name. Familiarity lived here, modest and unremarkable. When he picked the child up later, they talked about a spelling test and a story about animals who built a house together. The child's voice rose and fell with the details, confident that someone was listening. At home, homework came first. He sat nearby, reading through old paperwork, answering questions when asked. Dinner simmered on the stove, filling the apartment with warmth. They ate together at the small table, knees almost touching, sharing bread and quiet pauses. That evening, as the child colored at the table, he stepped into the hallway closet and retrieved a box from the top shelf. Inside were reminders of other versions of life. An old uniform, certificates, a photograph taken years ago. He did not linger over them. He closed the box and returned it to its place. Later, after the child was asleep, he sat by the window again. The city moved outside, distant and indifferent. He felt the weight of responsibility settle, not heavy, but constant. Whatever had been taken from him, this remained. He rose, checked the locks, adjusted the blanket on the child's bed, and turned off the lights. This life was smaller than the one he had guarded before, but it was held carefully with both hands. The information surfaced without ceremony, the way most truths did when they had waited long enough. It appeared not as an alarm or an urgent summons, but as a flagged file placed quietly into a digital queue, one more item among many, time-stamped weeks earlier and never opened. She encountered it late in the evening. The office was nearly empty by then. Most of the lights had dimmed automatically, leaving only her floor illuminated against the darkened city. She preferred these hours. Fewer interruptions. Fewer expectations of performance. The day's meetings were done, the decisions already made. What remained was review. She opened the file without anticipation. The footage loaded slowly, grainy at first, then clearer. A corridor she recognized immediately, a date that registered with a faint tightening behind her eyes. She leaned back slightly, arms folding, attention sharpening not with suspicion, but with habit. The incident had been logged as resolved. A procedural failure. A deviation in protocol. She remembered approving the conclusion, trusting the summary presented to her. She had not questioned it then. There had been other matters pressing in from all sides. Now she watched. The angle shifted, showing what had not been included in the original report. A moment of hesitation, a choice made quickly, decisively. The guard stepping out of formation, not to defy instruction, but to shield. The child visible only for a second, small and startled, before being moved safely out of frame. Her hand stilled on the mouse. She rewound the footage, watched again. Slower this time. There was no drama in it, no raised voices, only a sequence of restrained actions that told a different story than the one she had accepted. The guard had not compromised security. He had absorbed risk quietly, redirecting it away from someone who could not have understood the danger. The file included a brief note appended days later. A junior analyst's observation, a recommendation to reassess. It had gone unread. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in regret exactly, but in recognition. Mistakes were inevitable in systems this large. She had built her career understanding that. What unsettled her now was not the error itself, but the cost of it. A man dismissed without defense. A decision finalized without the full shape of the truth. She reopened the file, scanning the employment record attached. Years of service. No disciplinary marks. Consistent evaluations. A quiet reliability that had made him easy to overlook. She remembered him then not clearly, but enough. A presence near the edge of rooms. Stillness without stiffness. The way he had positioned himself instinctively between her and others, never drawing attention to it. She had trusted that presence without ever learning its name. The memory sharpened unexpectedly around one detail, the child's hand tucked briefly into his before being guided away. She had seen it once, passing through a corridor. It had registered only as an ordinary thing. She stood, walking to the window. The city spread below her, indifferent and lit in fragments. Power had always meant distance to her. Height. Perspective. Tonight, it felt like separation. She returned to her desk and opened a new document. The cursor blinked, waiting. She typed slowly, carefully, choosing language that did not lean on authority more than necessary. The message was not an apology. Not yet. It was an acknowledgement. She requested a meeting, not through intermediaries, direct. Before sending it, she paused, reading the words again. They were spare, honest, unprotected by legal framing. She sent it, across town, in an apartment that held the quiet residue of evening. He sat at the table with a cup of tea cooling beside him. The child was asleep, the door left slightly open out of habit. Papers were spread neatly in front of him, not job applications yet, just records, reminders of who he had been. The message arrived without sound. He noticed the light on his phone only when he stood to rinse his cup. He hesitated before checking it, not out of fear, but caution. Expectations had learned to keep their distance. He read the message once, then again. There was no demand in it, no justification offered, only a request to speak, framed with an awareness of time and space and an acknowledgement of the circumstances under which he had left. He set the phone down and stood still for a long moment. The past did not rush back. Neither did hope. What settled instead was a measured curiosity, tempered by responsibility. Whatever this was, it would touch more than just him. He looked toward the child's room, listening to the steady rhythm of sleep. Protection still came first. It always would. When he picked up the phone again, his reply was brief. Polite. Non-committal. He agreed to meet. The signal had been received. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough to change the direction of what came next. The meeting was scheduled for mid-morning, neither rushed nor delayed into evening. The location was not her office. That had been specified in the message that followed his acceptance. Neutral ground. A small conference room on a lower floor. Windows that opened. A table without polish. He arrived 10 minutes early, as he always did. The building still carried the quiet efficiency of wealth, but this floor felt less guarded, less ceremonial. He noted exits out of habit, then let the awareness soften. He was not here in that capacity. She entered alone. There was no entourage, no assistant trailing behind with a tablet. She wore a simple coat, dark and unremarkable, her hair pulled back without precision. For a moment, They regarded one another in silence. It was not awkward. It was simply unpracticed. "Thank you for coming," she said. He inclined his head. "You asked." They sat. The space between them was measured, respectful. She did not begin with explanations. Instead, she placed a printed still frame from the footage on the table, sliding it gently toward him. "I saw this," she said. "Late." He looked at the image without reaction. He recognized the moment immediately, the weight of the child's small body as he had guided them aside, the calculation of distance and timing that had followed. It had not felt exceptional then. It still did not. "There was more context than I was given," she continued. "I should have waited for it." He folded his hands together. "The decision was yours to make." "Yes," she said quietly, "and so is correcting it." There was no promise in her tone, only intent. They spoke for less than 20 minutes. About the incident, about process failures, about what could and could not be undone. She did not ask him to return to his previous position. He did not ask for restitution. What passed between them was narrower and more precise. Before they stood, she said, "I'd like to see you again. Not in this capacity." He considered this. "I have a child," he said, "not as leverage, but as boundary." "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm asking carefully." They parted without handshake. The next encounter happened a week later, not in a building owned by her name, but in a public park near his apartment. The invitation had included a question rather than an assumption. He had agreed after consulting the small calendar on the refrigerator, the one with school events marked in careful ink. The child came with him. She arrived carrying nothing but a folded scarf and a book tucked under her arm. The child regarded her openly, without awe or fear. Children measured people by attention, not reputation. They sat on a bench while the child played nearby, always within his line of sight. Conversation moved slowly. Weather, the park's trees, the book she carried. She listened more than she spoke, her posture angled not toward him, but toward the child's movement. When the child approached with a question about the ducks, she answered directly, crouching to their level, pointing toward the water. She did not perform warmth. She allowed it. After that, presence became pattern. Sometimes it was a walk. Sometimes it was sitting quietly while the child read aloud, stumbling over longer words. She learned the rhythm of their days without interfering with it. He observed her consistency, the way she arrived when she said she would, the way she left without stretching the moment. Meals came later, simple ones, soup shared at the small table, bread passed hand to hand. She noticed the care he took, checking temperature, cutting food smaller without comment, listening with full attention when the child spoke. He noticed the way she adapted, shoes left by the door without instruction, phone silenced and placed face down, her gaze shifting instinctively when the child moved too close to the stove. Nothing was named. What grew between them was not desire, but trust, the kind that formed when routines overlapped without friction. She began to understand the architecture of his life, its limits, its quiet strength. He began to see her not as power, but as presence, learning how to soften. One evening, as the child set the table with uneven precision, she stood beside him at the sink. "You don't have to stay," he said, not unkindly. "I know," she replied. "I choose to." The words stayed with him longer than she did. As weeks passed, their time together found a rhythm that did not need reinforcement. She no longer asked in advance what would be acceptable. She observed, adjusted, learned. There were days she did not come at all, and days when she stayed longer, always calibrated to the child's energy rather than her own availability. The child began to anticipate her presence without expectation. When she arrived, there was no rush toward her, no rehearsed greeting. Sometimes the child offered a drawing, sometimes the child offered a drawing. Sometimes nothing at all. She accepted both with equal ease. On one afternoon softened by rain, the three of them remained indoors. The windows fogged lightly as soup warmed on the stove. The child spread colored pencils across the table, arranging them with careful deliberation. "Do you want one?" the child asked her, holding up a blue pencil. She accepted it, sitting where she was shown. Her posture was tentative at first, as though uncertain of the space she was allowed to occupy. The child watched her hands closely, then returned to the drawing, satisfied. He moved between them, washing dishes, drying them, placing them back in their places. The apartment held their quiet without strain. Later, as the child read on the couch, voice low and steady, she sat nearby, knees drawn in slightly, listening. He noticed the way she followed the story, not the words, but the cadence of the child's voice. When a sentence was read incorrectly, she did not correct it. Neither did he. Accuracy was less important than continuity. After the child went to bed, she lingered by the door. "You don't owe us this," he said, not looking at her. She rested her hand against the frame. "I know." There was a pause, the kind that did not ask to be filled. "I'm learning," she added, "how not to mistake distance for control." He turned then, meeting her eyes. There was no challenge in his gaze, only assessment, careful and human. "That takes time," he said. "I have it," she replied. The following days tested that claim quietly. A meeting ran long, a message went unanswered until late. When she arrived the next evening, she did not explain. She apologized briefly, without self-justification. The child accepted it with a nod and returned to building a structure from blocks. He watched her rebuild trust the way it was meant to be rebuilt, not through reassurance, but through consistency restored. One evening, the child fell asleep on the couch mid-sentence, books slipping from their hands. He lifted them gently, carrying them to bed. She followed, standing in the doorway as he tucked the blanket, smoothed hair from the child's forehead, waited until breathing settled. In the hallway, she spoke softly. "You're very careful." "With them," he said. "With everything." She nodded, understanding more than the words allowed. They did not touch. What formed between them lived in shared responsibility, in the way she began to plan meetings around school schedules, in the way he allowed her to handle small tasks, washing a cup, straightening a chair without reclaiming control. One afternoon, she brought groceries without being asked. Nothing extravagant. Fruit the child liked, bread he usually bought. She placed the bags on the counter and waited for his reaction. "Thank you," he said. That was all. Later, when she left, the child asked, "Is she part of us now?" He considered the question carefully. "She's someone we spend time with." The child accepted this, satisfied. As the door closed behind her that evening, he stood alone in the quiet, aware of something settling into place. Not excitement, not fear, a steadiness that felt earned. Shared space had become shared care. And in that, something fragile had found room to grow without being named. The first strain appeared not as conflict, but as imbalance. It came in the form of time, how easily hers could stretch, and how carefully his had to be measured. A late afternoon call extended into evening. A planned walk was shortened. None of it was dramatic enough to name, yet the shift was felt all the same. The child noticed first. "Is she busy again?" the child asked one night, tracing the rim of a cup with a finger. "She has work," he said. "So do you," the child replied, not accusing, only stating what felt uneven. He did not answer right away. That night, after the child slept, he sat with the notebook open again, numbers adjusted in tighter margins. Stability was not only emotional, it was practical, predictable. He had learned to distrust anything that depended too heavily on someone else's availability. The next day, when she arrived later than planned, he did not comment. He welcomed her, offered tea, continued the evening's routine. She sensed the distance nonetheless. "You're quieter," she said once the child was occupied. "So are you," he replied. The truth of it rested between them without accusation. Pressure did not come from her alone. It arrived through messages she did not show him, through meetings she postponed and then attended anyway, through a world that expected her presence without exception. She began to feel the cost of choosing carefully, of stepping out of constant visibility. When the invitation came, an event she was expected to attend, a public appearance meant to reassure investors. She hesitated longer than she had ever allowed herself to. The child's school recital was the same evening. She told him about it while standing near the window. Hands folded, posture still. I don't have to go, she said. He turned to face her fully. You shouldn't stay because you feel you must. And you shouldn't let me because it's easier, she replied. The child, overhearing fragments, asked later, Are you leaving? She knelt to answer, Not tonight. But the question lingered. He feared becoming a point of tension rather than refuge. She feared that choosing them would dismantle the life she had built. Neither spoke these fears aloud. They surfaced instead in restraint, in pauses that grew slightly longer. On the evening of the recital, she arrived early, dressed simply, coat folded over her arm. The child searched for her face among the audience and smiled when they found it. She did not check her phone once. Afterward, applause faded. Parents gathered, and the child clutched a paper certificate with pride. She stood beside him, offering congratulations without claiming proximity. Later, walking home, she said, I missed something important tonight. He waited, and I was where I needed to be. The words were not triumphant. They were weighted. That night, as she prepared to leave, he stopped her at the door. I won't ask you to choose, he said, but I need to know you're choosing honestly. She met his gaze. So do I. Responsibility pressed inward from all sides, not as threat, but as truth. Whatever they were building could not survive half measures. The weight was real now, and it would require more than goodwill to carry it. The decision did not arrive all at once. It formed gradually, shaped by small refusals and quieter affirmations, by what she stopped doing as much as by what she began to do differently. She declined an early morning flight without delegating an excuse. She shortened meetings that drifted without purpose. She moved one standing commitment to another day, then another. The changes were subtle enough to avoid notice, but deliberate enough to hold. He observed without comment. Trust, he had learned, was not something to be negotiated aloud. It revealed itself through repetition. The child sensed the shift in ways that were neither strategic nor sentimental. They noticed that she arrived before dinner more often, that she stayed long enough to help dry dishes, that she remembered which book was currently being read and where the last chapter had ended. One evening, while the child worked through homework at the table, she sat beside him, reviewing documents spread neatly between them. Not contracts, not corporate material, schedules, logistics, a map of days. This is where I can be consistent, she said, pointing to blocks of time she had marked and left untouched. Not indefinitely, but reliably. He studied the page. And when you can't, I'll say so, she replied, before it becomes absence. He nodded once. Later that night, as the child slept, they stood together at the window. The city moved below them, distant and abstract. You don't owe us permanence, he said. She answered without hesitation. I'm not offering permanence. I'm offering presence. The distinction mattered. The next week, she made a choice that did not announce itself publicly. A position was restructured. Authority was shared rather than centralized. She stepped back from one role and absorbed another, more quietly. The world adjusted around her without collapsing. At home, nothing changed dramatically. Dinner still came at the same hour. The child still needed reminders to brush their teeth thoroughly. He still locked the door twice before bed. What changed was the certainty of return. One afternoon, the child asked, Will you be here tomorrow? She smiled, not carefully but honestly, Yes. And next week? She glanced at him, then back at the child. Yes. The child accepted this without celebration. That evening, as she prepared to leave, he said, You're staying later. She nodded. If that's all right. It is. They sat at the table long after the dishes were cleared, not speaking much. Silence had grown familiar, no longer a space to fill but one to share. When she stood to go, he walked her to the door. You chose, he said quietly. She met his eyes. So did you. The door closed behind her, but the choice remained, unspoken, steady, and held. The change announced itself through quiet permanence rather than arrival. She did not move into the apartment. Not fully. There was no moment where a suitcase appeared by the door or a drawer was cleared in her name. Instead, smaller things accumulated. A pair of shoes left intentionally this time. A toothbrush placed beside his, not as claim, but convenience. A book resting on the nightstand in the living room where she sometimes stayed late enough to need it. The child accepted these details without ceremony. Life settled into a pattern that no longer required adjustment. Mornings remained his domain breakfast, coats, the walk to school. Some afternoons she joined them at the gate, other days she did not. When she was absent, it was explained beforehand. When she was present, it was never made into an event. The apartment held them easily now. There were evenings when she read aloud while the child followed along, finger tracing the lines. Evenings when he cooked and she washed dishes, working in quiet coordination. Sometimes all three sat together without speaking, the comfort of shared presence filling the room. One night, the power went out unexpectedly. The child startled, then laughed when the lights failed to return. He found the flashlight. She lit a candle. Shadows gathered on the walls, soft and steady. "It's nicer like this," the child said. "It won't last," he replied gently. "That's all right," the child said. "We're still here." Later, after the child slept, they sat together on the couch, the candle nearly spent. She rested her hands in her lap. He leaned back, tired in a way that felt earned. "This feels like home," she said quietly. He did not answer immediately. Home had been a fragile word for him once, too easily threatened. "It is," he said finally. "Because it stays." She nodded. There were no promises spoken aloud, no declarations of future certainty. What existed between them did not need to be secured by language. It lived in repetition in mornings that followed nights, in plans kept and altered honestly, in the child's unguarded ease. On a Sunday afternoon, they walked together to the park. The child ran ahead, calling back occasionally. She walked beside him, their steps aligned without effort. At the bench near the water, the child sat between them, leaning first toward one, then the other. He watched the city move beyond the trees and felt no urgency to return to it. What they had built was not large. It would not impress from a distance. But it held. And within that holding steady, ordinary, chosen, they belonged.